It's difficult to follow the two middle talks in particular, because they both raise major issues of social injustice and inequality that John brought up at the beginning, but also the kind of material difficulties of doing ethnographic work, doing research with partners, and where that can go wrong, where that relationship between research and research communities, people who want research, where there's different types. And we've got a conflict. The conflict John described as one between a kind of higher education of where knowledge has been marketised, where we're being asked to work to an agenda which is going to reproduce and deepen inequalities. And then we've got people who want us to help them do research that can highlight those inequalities, ironically, and that can address them and communicate them and intervene and be activist around them. So, it's a difficult set of, it's a difficult situation that we face, I think, in the sociological and social science community. One of the reasons I think it's difficult is because we are very basic understandings, I think, of what a society is, of what social change is and might mean, of what civil society is, what a public is. All of those things have been very rapidly and dramatically transformed. And I think this means that we're, in a way, our vocabulary for talking about and communicating ideas with each other and to the wider world are challenged at the moment. And one of the things I think we need are new political vocabularies that can translate these changes that are taking place. So as well as kind of trying to resist the sort of marketisation of higher education and the marketisation of knowledge, part of that resistance is going to have to be one of crafting or making something out of a language of resistance that we can use as a kind of new toolkit for addressing the real research problems and questions that are emerging. So this might include things like returning to notions of social class. What does it actually mean to talk about social class today? I mean, it seems obvious, but perhaps it isn't obvious at all, actually. I don't think it is obvious. I think our very understandings of social class have been transformed by neoliberal economic and political and policy agendas. And I think we need to go back to those classic concepts and rework them and create theoretical vocabularies and concepts that are adequate to address those changes. And it's really good to hear the word inequality come through, and equality and justice come through already on this first panel, because I think this is what's really at stake is deepening inequalities that are threatening actually to destroy the fabric of our society and of our communities. And I think what we might need to try and do today is think about why inequalities exist, why they're growing. Those two questions we might be able to answer quite easily. But how inequality, there's different histories and forms of inequalities are intersecting. So it's not just we're getting new types of inequality, but actually older histories of inequality, be they gendered, be they around disability, be they around things like citizenship, are kind of re-emerging in new ways. How do we measure and classify inequality? And I think what came through here was how that can become part of the problem that stigmatised communities are re-stigmatised through research practices, through our practices of classification as academics and social scientists. How are inequalities to be resisted? How do we resist the deepening of inequalities? And what kinds of new types of identities are emerging as a consequence of the deepening of inequalities and unequal social relations that we're seeing at the moment, and what's going to be the future consequence of these inequalities? So we might think about even like categories like work are being radically transformed through, for example, penal systems of workfare being brought in. What's happening to young people who can't find work or are working for free or are working in precarious positions, and what kinds of working identities are those young people getting, and what's the kind of future for them? What's the impact of that on future societies? So these are some of the massive number of questions, I think, that are being addressed, partly, but very often addressed in fragmented ways within academia more generally. So we can kind of get people working one type of inequality over here, concerned with class, and we get people working maybe on issues around citizenship and race and migration over here, and we don't get enough of a conversation about the sort of deep political and social issues at stake more generally. And I think sociology is the discipline that can bring those questions together and bring those different types of marginality and inequality and questions about them together. And then one more thing I want to say is about academia and society. So one thing we always end up doing, and people do generally, is reproduce the notion of the university as though the university is outside of the social. So as though the university is separate from, or academia is separate from the social world. And it might feel like that some of the time, but actually the university, like the rest of society at the moment, is being, pretty much, I think, radically attacked from the inside out. And the university is part of the social, is part of society, and we as social beings are part of universities and communities. We're activists very often and academics. So I kind of would like that to be on the agenda today, that we don't reproduce insides and outsides, or we rethink them in a better way than we tend to.